Oh, well, I once admitted to someone in ministry that I was a bit of a perfectionist. And anyone listening to this who is also a perfectionist will know that it can actually be a really crippling issue because it is often accompanied, isn't it, by a sense of guilt and condemnation and failure. But this person's reply was that I should do a written study about grace. And as I prayed that God would teach me about grace, my thoughts homed in on John chapter 8, which is the account of the woman caught in the act of adultery. And that short passage is a brilliant illustration of the fact that grace is truly stronger and more powerful than condemnation. Well, this is how I picture the scene. Somehow or other, the Pharisees and religious rulers get to know that this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. And this group of men who consider that they have cornered the market in righteousness take it upon themselves to drag her to a place where Jesus is teaching a really large crowd. So it's a very public scene. And I think she's there for two reasons. Firstly, perhaps for a bit of ritual humiliation. But secondly, on a grander scale, she's a pawn in a larger scheme they have. She's a handy tool and they're making use of her. But Jesus covers both those dynamics with incredible grace. Firstly, the woman herself, terrified, utterly humiliated. Everyone now knows her most intimate business, and she could have been stoned for what she had done. But even if she survives physically, she's going to certainly be a social pariah from now on. She was a Jewish woman, otherwise the Pharisees wouldn't have bothered with her. So she knew the law of God, and for that reason she'd probably have been regretting her actions on the basis of her conscience alone, even if she hadn't been caught. Was it really worth it? The deception, the secrecy that she would have had to keep up, the sense that she'd let herself down, let her husband down, even let God down. There really was nothing good about this situation. There were no winners. The woman had lost, her husband had lost, her lover had lost. But what is brilliant about this is that in a grace-filled, God-ordained error, the Pharisees, with their intention of condemning her, physically drag her to her Saviour. They take her to him for him to judge her, and she may well have expected this from him herself. And the Pharisees put their case. She's been caught red-handed, Jesus. You know the law. She has to be stoned. And then their real, unspoken agenda. But by the way, if you tell us to stone her, and you know you must because that is God's law, you also know that we're under Roman rule and it's not legal for Jews to condemn anyone to death. You must condemn her, but if you do, we'll make sure the Romans hear about it. There you go, get out of that. It was obvious to Jesus that they had an agenda because they always did. They were forever trying to trap him into saying something incriminating. So in fact, for them, the woman was probably little more than a theatrical prop. But it's clear that to Jesus, she was the most important person there. And he was certainly not going to let anything deflect him from being the saviour that he'd come to earth to be. I have to admit that if it had been me, I would have been really annoyed with the Pharisees, and doubtless if I possessed the insight into the hearts of men that Jesus did, I'd have found a way to say something like, well, Pharisee Smith, and were all your thoughts really pure last week? Or something equally unhelpful. But not Jesus. He doesn't just show grace to this woman in her broken, fallen state. He rolls it out to the Pharisees and religious leaders as well, even though they haven't shown any themselves. They bring this woman by force, possibly even from her bed, into the middle of a crowd. But Jesus merely asks them to look privately for a moment into their own hearts and consciences. And he gives them permission to condemn her, just as long as they can be sure they're righteous enough to do it. And so one by one, silently, they all walk away. And when they're gone, the woman's facing the one man who justifiably could condemn her. And we will all stand before him one day. But his words to this woman, where are they? Did no one condemn you? No one, Lord, she replies. And his reply, then neither do I condemn you. Go your way. From now on, sin no more. Such an awesome moment. This woman must have gone through, in the space of about 5 minutes, a whole gamut of emotions. Humiliation, terror, despair, amazement, wonder, redemption, restoration. And I love the woman's reply because it really underlines where she's got to spiritually in her encounter with Jesus. No one, Lord. Lord. Like Thomas on seeing Jesus after his resurrection, my Lord and my God. The woman's life has turned around. And in a staggeringly short space of time, she's gone from living a life of sin, hurting herself and those around her, to being forced to openly acknowledge and face the consequences of her sin, to finding that there was redemption for her where judgment should have been. So it was no wonder Jesus instantly became her Lord. And in that one word acknowledgement of Jesus' identity, the woman's whole life is reordered. He takes his rightful place in her life. He tells her to sin no more, which I once thought was kind of a telling off. But why would he do that, when a minute ago he could have chosen to condemn her and chose not to? No, it was a simple redemptive transaction. She acknowledged his lordship of her life, and he responded by giving her his instructions for how he wanted her to live. And salvation is simple. What he did for that woman that day, he can do for us. He's done for me. Our individual situations means that we experience it differently. Thankfully, I've never had to endure the public awfulness that poor woman did. But I'm so grateful that I undertook this exercise, because I've been powerfully reminded that when I go to meet my judge, I will find my Saviour. And even if I look for his condemnation, I will only ever find his grace. As this story reminds us, because of God's grace we are forgiven, but there is more. To live any aspect of our Christian walk, we need grace. But grace is a divine resource and we're human. And since because of this we can't generate grace, this has to come from God, who will graciously provide us with grace so that we can live a grace-filled life. And suddenly to me it seems that grace is everything, that we need to allow it to pervade every area of our lives. For instance, someone has wronged me. I know I should forgive them, but I'm wounded and angry. They should be sorry. They should make some sort of restitution. Those sorts of emotions flood over all of us sometimes. But we are called to forgive others as Jesus forgave us, because unmerited forgiveness is the currency of heaven. Jesus could have chosen to judge the woman, but he chose something infinitely more powerful and beautiful than anything any human mind can fully grasp. And in my little study on grace, I realised that I have just touched the tiny tip of an immeasurably huge iceberg, and it blew me away. Because this is a grace that is more powerful than our sin. It's more powerful than our shame. It's more powerful than our guilt. This is a grace that is more powerful than anything in life. It's more powerful even than death. And because of the death and resurrection of Jesus, it is a grace that is available to us all at any time.